Why, hello everybody. My name is Steve Usher and a warm welcome to the Experienced Designers podcast. So Dieter Rams, one of my absolute favourite designers. He's a German industrial designer if you haven't heard of him before. Probably more famous for his close association with the consumer products company Braun. He was once quoted saying, "The indifference towards people and the reality in which they live is actually the one and only cardinal sin in design." So what if we just changed the word design for a moment to business? So instead it reads, "Indifference towards people and the reality in which they live is actually the one and only cardinal sin in business." And let's just break this down a little bit further. So indifference towards people. So this would relate to words such as disregard, ignore, overlook, apathy. And then we also have reality in which they live. So this, for me, relates to things such as empathy and walking in the shoes of the people you're designing for or serving. And the cornerstone of any design process or employee experience strategy is empathy and listening. And whether it's in the traditional qualitative research sense or regular listening posts along the employee journey, or even an annual engagement survey, all of these efforts and activities form the basis of listening and are vital to the employee experience. So putting aside any preconceptions or biases or assumptions and using feedback to inform you on where you need to be focusing valuable time, resource and budget. And as technology advances have allowed us to listen and capture feedback and data more than ever, the importance of using the words and the feedback to greater effect presents massive opportunities for HR functions and organisations. So today you'll be meeting Andrew Marritt, CEO of Organisational View, based in Switzerland, and he focuses, and for a large proportion of his career, exclusively on turning responses to open-ended questions containing millions of words into valuable insights, ideas and outcomes. And as we share insights into the evolution of feedback, designing experiences and top tips on getting started with capturing valuable feedback. So as always, thank you ever so much for listening and enjoy the show. So Andrew, welcome to the Experienced Designers.
No, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, welcome. So as always with my guests, let's jump straight in. Let's a brief introduction to yourself, or a little bit about your background and your passions, and where you are in this planet and what you're doing for a living.
Okay, so I'm Andrew Marritt. I am the founder and chief executive of Organisational View, which is one of the oldest people analytics practices. We were founded in 2010. My background was, originally I was a childhood geek. My father built a computer from a kit in the 70s, and I learned to program late 70s, sort of when I was about 7. Geekness wasn't very cool in the 80s, so instead of going off and reading computer science, which would have probably been useful now, I went off and did maths and economics, spent most of the 90s in consultancy, and then most of the following decade, from 1990 to 2009, in big corporates, mostly financial services sector, sitting in the intersection between HR departments and the marketing and branding teams, doing things such as employment marketing, brand research, those type of activities. Then in 2009, sitting on the HR management team of a big European industrial and watching how badly everyone was doing data in the HR department. I have to say it wasn't to that last company. I decided to found a business to focus on it. So we've been going for over 10 years now. The key areas have started with around this, bringing the sort of analytical techniques that we used in marketing into looking at people. And in the last 5 years, we focused almost exclusively on text-based feedback and applying what a lot of your audience would associate with AI to very, very large amounts of feedback to give executives an understanding of what people are talking about within their organizations.
Yeah, amazing.
In terms of passions, I'm very, very fortunate to live up at almost 2,000 meters in St. Moritz in Switzerland, one of the most beautiful places in the world. We've been remote since 2009, as well as the normal things that people do up here. I also keen marathon swimmer in the summer, and in the winter, keen crest rider. So go down there. Go down an ice canal on my front, 5 centimeters away from the ice with my chin.
Oh, amazing! Good lifestyle, mate. Good lifestyle. I think what I'm super interested in exploring today, just hearing your background, and I think some of the pieces there around that intersection between kind of HR and marketing, that's super interesting. Still being kind of discussed and debated to a certain degree today, as companies are still in some respects figuring that out for some reason, but also kind of HR function. And I think certainly as a function itself, the analytics requirements has been steadily increasing year on year for some time now. Probably driven by technology, of course, but also the needs for listening and understanding. And getting a much clearer understanding about what the most captive audience that you have as a business, which is your people. And then also the final one is, I think for me, like text-based feedback. It's where the gold is, and ultimately, if you can mine that gold effectively, then there's untold possibilities and benefits for the organisation. So I'm really keen. And it's still definitely something which is very, very hot right now, and so keen to delve a little bit more into some of the evolutions and developments in this area with you as well. Just going back, just to delve a little bit in, because it was just something I picked up on your profile, actually, if I may, which was some of your experience at UBS. So some of the work you did there, just tying into some of that intersection piece, the new joiner experience, was that kind of back then? I don't want to show your age here, but I mean, is it back then? Was that kind of seen as kind of a bit cutting edge, a bit kind of advanced back then? Thinking about new joiner experience, how people experience as onboarding.
Yeah, I think so. At the time, it didn't feel like advanced. So at UBS, I mean, I've been doing marketing for several years before, so it wasn't the first area, and a lot of the type of experience work that we'd done. But UBS was and is predominantly a wealth management, so a private banking organization. It's the world's largest, and a lot of the way that you sell wealth management is around experience, right? So they have the private banks or the wealth management businesses have big experience design teams. They look at every single aspect, whether they have architects, they look at the smell going into the business, the buildings, and they focus on a really, really crazy amount. So the organization was sort of set up and tuned up for that type of work. And the senior executives were used to it because it wasn't new for them. There was some data that I've seen from actually one of the other banks where they'd done some research and found out that 70% of purchase decisions within banking were experience-based. And we did some data, I cut some data from, I think it was the Corporate Leadership Council, one of those type of organizations who had done some research on what people wanted in an employee value proposition. We found about 70% of them were experience type related. So with that type of data on hand, it became quite obvious to do it. I also, as I said, was sitting at least half the time in brand and research and all the folks I would be dealing with. So, sitting back, I was with some fantastic experienced design people. And, it became obvious in some ways to try and apply that into HR. And we did some early work also in the early days of Organization View in 2010 on experience design, but it was mainly financial services, it was mainly private banks. And the rest of the organizations sort of nodded but had no interest in experience in HR. And I think that probably changed in about 2016. We started coming in, by which time obviously I'd focused on other things, thinking that HR was never going to get this experience part, and moved on. So yeah, it was good, but it was very much coming from what was then the sort of a cutting edge, really systematic approach to experience and experience design. And a lot of it was numbers based, a lot of it was research focused. It was very systematic. And, listening to people and looking at, well, for me, there's two parts of experience data. There's the listening part of why people are doing it, and often the more qualitative parts where you may be viewing people doing it, or using sort of more qualitative approach, but also combining with that quantitative and actually sort of saying, well, actually is what they're telling us what is actually what we're seeing in the data, right? And web and digital tools enable you to track everything, so you can start building quite detailed pictures. From let's take a recruitment perspective, you can see where people drop off. You can run on so that part there, and I remember at the time it was really hard to get the applicant tracking tools to provide us with drop-off data at different parts in the process so we can optimize that. So we just ran usability studies, and we recruited people into who are target market, and we videoed them using it and trying to get them to do it, and that type of thing became really, really valuable. So it's always been, my approach to experience has always been very data centric, but I don't define data as just numbers, right? It's this mixture of qual data and quant data, and you have to balance the two together, and that's where you really get the power.
Yeah, I agree. And from a listening strategy perspective, and specifically, let's talk from an EX based run CX. What have you seen the evolution? How have you seen it evolve over perhaps the last 10 years or 5 years or whatever? Let's not put a time on it, but just how have you seen it evolve generally? What are you seeing?
I think the big difference, certainly from what we can do now compared to what we could do back then, was the use of non-structured data, or rather not conventionally structured data. So, for example, at UBS, we launched a survey that went to all of the 16,000 people a year that we hired at the end of 100 days. And it was a traditional survey. It had 50, 60 questions, and a lot of those had parallels with the engagement survey so that we could track it across. Now, obviously, in hindsight, there's difficulties in there because everybody's still on the honeymoon period. So your level of engagement is 90-something%, and you're not, and there's no variance, and therefore you're not learning much. These days, the way that we work with our clients when we're doing experience type stuff is they're asking shorter survey questions, shorter surveys, and they're relying a lot more on the qualitative part and the text, and that's really technology enabling you to do that, because we're, even at UBS with 16,000 people joining a year, looking at all that data and having a process to go through and identify trends is hard. And even if you were able to get a team to review it, they wouldn't spot the patterns, right? So we tend to, the way that we remember comments and things, we remember powerfully written ones, we remember ones that support our own worldview. We do a lot of those type of things and bring our own human biases in, and the algorithms can take a step back and just say, this is an anomaly detection. We've detected this is a big issue in this particular area, and that looks really unusual. Here's the response as human. How do you interpret that? And that's much more interesting. So I think we're seeing more of that type of work. But I see a lot of the HR departments making mistakes maybe that the customer experience people were doing 15 years ago, right? So not relying on data. There seems to be too many people where they get a working group of people who've got sort of skin in the game, heads of recruitment, to design what the ideal process or what experience would look like without actually listening to the people who are there, going through it. And you really just have to listen, and you almost have to throw your own ideas out of the window and rely on that type of data rather than trying to design something perfect yourself.
Absolutely. It's kind of empathic data, isn't it? You have to put yourself to one side for a moment and just start to implement, even on a first phase of listening, just to kind of keep it as non-influenced on your own bias or asking the questions that you want to hear the answer for. To, I know when we've done some candidate experience listening work, it's fascinating to see. And I'm not a research expert. I always absolutely bring in research experts because I see it is an art form, and it's a very specialist discipline in its own right, and rightly so. But it's interesting how the different stakeholders suddenly become experts in writing survey questions. And I've had some sent to me and they've been all pretty much closed questions. And it's just like, So I think that's some of the individualistic kind of stuff that you have to battle. But
we're in a tourist area, and I think that's so obviously hotels and people are interesting, and a lot of my friends run big hotels, and they're actually some of them. Sandwich is famous for 5-star hotels, and the way that they deal with feedback is just immense, right? So that it becomes the thing that they live for, and they have senior level meetings of all of the heads of departments every single day to go through every single bit of feedback and review it on a one-to-one basis. It's their life. And but in terms of the way, if we think about candidate experience, which is probably the oldest part of the experience from HR perspective, candidates don't have this clear delineation between how you are as a business and how you are as a recruiter. So we did a piece of, and also they're heavily skewed to people who like you as an organization, as you would imagine, right? But we did a piece of work, I did a piece of work 16, 17 years ago with one of the big retail banks in the UK, where we looked at, we could find out who banked with, what bank the candidates banked with, because we were paying expenses. So everybody had to give their account number, and we could look at the sort code and go, okay, well, they're banking with NatWest and they're banking with Barclays and things. And the bank concerned, if you looked at the overall population, you'd expect about 15 to 18% of all candidates to be coming as customers, given the type. And we were doing a big campaign to hire 1,000 people, so it was big. It was over 50% of all candidates were customers. And when we've seen that sort of data, we realized that it's if you're annoying them, you're annoying customers, right? If you're not treating them well. We did a piece of work with an insurer here in Switzerland 8, 9, 10 years ago, looking at candidate experience again in the recruitment process. And the way that recruiters were at the time working is that they would not reject anyone until somebody had got the offer, right? Somebody had accepted offer. So the average time that a person who didn't get called for interview was waiting to hear anything was 100 days, right? So if they were called for interview, they would hear after 15 days average, right? Because they would get called for interview, or they get called for that. And but the people who didn't hear a thing would have to wait 100 days there. And when we presented back, we had one of the marketing team in, and I just said to them, the data that we've seen suggests that these people aren't thinking that you are not good at recruitment, right? They're thinking, what will happen when I need to have a claim, and I do that process. Do they handle the claims process like they handle the recruitment process? So, starting to bring in that data is fascinating. But that's showing how you can use sort of quantitative data like times out of a recruitment system and date calculations. And that tells you what's happening, but it doesn't tell you why it's happening. And with the insurance, it was a really simple fix. The recruiters, when they decided to do first level, they rejected someone. And if it didn't get to the end of the process, they could reach back out and sort of say, hey, something's changed. We've had a look at your profile again. We'd like, are you still interested? And most people will be delighted to have that sort of call. And if they're not interested, it's probably because they found another job, and they would have found another job even if you had gone back without the conversation. So just putting in part that process, is thinking from an experience perspective, but you kind of have to look at the data as well.
So it's not so much an assumption, it's sort of what I see and what I hear, certainly in the industry. I think there's a lot more listening and research being undertaken.
Yep.
Generally, particularly from an HR point of view and from an employee experience point of view. You can see that by the various tools. And I know this year a lot of the listening organizations are doing very well, as obviously organizations are increasing the pulses, or certainly just keeping a closer kind of finger on the pulse with how the employees are thinking and feeling. But I just still get this sense that for particularly like situations like candidate experience, as an example, there's not enough appreciation, maybe is the word, or understanding of the opportunities that exist if you just put some research budget aside and actually do some proper thorough research, and the opportunities that exist in terms of themes or identifying moments that matter, whether it's good or bad or indifferent, to then turn that into a narrative and a story to influence stakeholders, to turn it into something meaningful that helps you deliver what you need to do as a stakeholder, but also make the necessary improvements in the experience. That's something which I really stand by. And I think that's something which I think there's not enough research happening.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And especially this year, lots has changed, right? The business environment now looks completely different. We've been doing a lot of work on the experience of working from home, and the data that we were getting in March, April is very different from the data we're getting now, right? And it's when something changes, you need to measure more frequently, right? So if I'm heading forward to one of my long distance marathon swims, I might be tracking my weight on a regular basis as I'm trying to get fitter, right? In desperate hope of 2 months before, and I still need to bring myself down. But I never measure my height, right? I don't measure my height on a weekly basis, but I might measure my weight because I don't expect my height to change, so therefore I don't need to measure it so often. And when something changes, when you realize it changes, you need to capture more frequent data. Now, I think you've seen this year a polarization of what's going on out there. There are a bunch of companies who are measuring frequently, who've put things in place. But I know a lot of companies who've stopped doing things. Sometimes the executives think that they'll hear bad news and therefore they won't ask. But there are huge optimization and even just operational efficiencies that you can get from listening to people and working out what the problems are. A lot of the stuff that we've traditionally found in text are really low-hanging fruit, right? They're often, we put in a policy and there's this side effect. Or if you did something really small, then it would make a huge difference to people's lives there. And a lot of it is often it's just somebody who's implemented something which for 90% of the population makes sense, but for 10% of the population is an absolute pain in the neck. And usually they're really easy things to fix, right? So putting those parts in and doing those sort of small gains all the time can make a huge overall difference in terms of approach. But sometimes you do find quite big things that people just aren't aware that's going on. Executives talk to their N-2 and that's it. They never hear what Martha in the Berry branch is really experiencing. And so, to give you the sort of some of the more trivial examples, it's things like, I know one of the big tech firms, their warehouses are so big that the people can't get to the coffee room and back, or the toilet in back, in their break time, because they get 15 minutes break, and they've got this warehouse that's 20 something football fields long, and they just physically can't get to the warehouse. So all of the thing is spent walking backwards and forwards to the break room. Or we found places where the coffee machines and the timer, and it comes on exactly the start time when people go to work, and people actually want to go in 10 minutes early and grab a coffee before going out on the floor. It's that sort of thing that just put the timer on for 10 minutes early. Okay, that'll improve
That
somebody's.
solves, yeah. There's a lot of those hygiene factor stuff, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of those kind of little basic nuances when you walk into an office. Is it the chairs break on a regular basis? Is it in a call center, for an example? Is it the headsets aren't particularly great? All these kind of things that, they do add up as part of an overall experience. And I think rightly so. I mean, I think I mentioned in my last podcast episode was, I always really, advise is yes, you start listening, but also be ready, like especially in that first or second set of data, with a kind of a pair of like white gloves on, ready for these low hanging fruits just to come out. So you go, right, let's solve it quickly, just to build that trust with employees. That
I think
actually,
that, and that's
they see action,
yeah,
they see it happening.
That's really, really important. And often these things that we're talking about are really simple to fix. So, if you've got a big survey going on, and you literally two or 3 days after closing, you can have a good overview of the text or the survey results these days, right? It doesn't take 6 weeks anymore to do this type of stuff. Put something on corporate comms saying, we heard a lot about this type of thing, therefore it's fixed. Right, 2 or 3 days after.
Yeah.
And I remember actually pre-text, we had a client, a Swiss telco company, one of the big mobile phone companies, and their chief exec used to read every single comment, right? Every single comment. He took it home. And what was more crazy, and you'll know this, sitting in Stockholm, he was Swedish. He used to read them in the original language. He refused to have them translated. And here in Switzerland, the survey was in 4 languages, right, because of the national boundaries. So he used to read every single one. And I remember we used to get lots of comments about, I know you're not going to read this, but... And he did the first town hall, which was probably a video when he goes, and to the person who started their comment, I know you're not going to read this, but I read every single one of these comments. and the response rate and the level of, one of the things we often look at is the length of responses, and we see the median response in employee surveys across most organizations is about 25 words in a question. Right, so they provide reasonable ones. We see answers over 1,000 words. Right, so we see some really long ones. Or we see a lot of people who say nothing, or and actually physically use the word nothing. What can we do to improve here? Nothing.
So the learning here is from a senior stakeholder, whether it's a chief exec or MD or whatever title, that it's all about them showing up as the leaders to say, I'm also either listening or I'm very much, I carve a proportion of my time to actually really engage in this.
Yeah, absolutely. Our clients are very large because this problem doesn't scale linearly. If you've got 50, 100,000 people, dealing with the text from there is, more than 50 or 100 times bigger than if you have 1,000 people like that mobile phone company did. So you do need to start applying algorithms to start helping you read it. But
Andrew,
we measure it.
How can sorry, because an important question just came to mind. So how can organizations then, because I think this is around, it's kind of that kind of triangle, isn't it? You've got all the data and it ends up becoming, as you mentioned earlier, this kind of one statistic that is seen at kind of C-suite level, but the story or the something that's a little bit richer that could really hit home and really influence that level. How can organizations kind of adapt something in that as well? I mean, I'll give you a very quick example with, say, IDEO, for an example, the world-renowned design consultancy. As part of some of their research phase in the design process, they, and once they obviously synthesize and start to create personas, they actually then create proper life-size cutouts of the actual personas, give them a height, and then actually bring it into the meetings and showcase them, just to start to create, it's slightly different, but it just creates this different visualization and a different story for people to connect with. How do you think companies could maybe do something like that with data, a particular employee insight data, just to bring that out a little bit more outside of just a number?
Yeah, so and then that reflects into one of my frustrations 10 years ago, right? So we would do some wonderful analysis, wonderful statistical analysis, and then we'd show a few quotes, and the executives act on the quotes, right? And go, well, but I've also done this, this statistical stuff took me ages. Here's a few quotes that we took. And then this is why we moved over towards, we don't do no numbers, but we think that you need to mix the numbers and the data. The numbers tell you what's happening. The text tells you why it's happening. In terms of humanizing it, so I wrote something about this in September, I believe. The first part of what you do when you're doing statistical analysis on text is you identify what are the topics in that text. We traditionally have done a bottoms-up approach, what is in the research community called an inductive approach, where you look at the text itself and sort of say, okay, what are the key themes within this text? And the text for John Lewis Partnership would be very different from the text for Google, because the employees would talk about different things. In fact, they might use the same words but mean different things. If I think about what would a Google person might talk about wanting more healthy food choices, and that would be about the canteen and the benefits and the free food as benefits. If somebody in Waitrose or John Lewis Partnership discussed that, they're possibly Waitrose would probably mean products on the shelves. So even there, you have to interpret the same words in a different context. So the first thing you do is you identify the themes, and then you go through every single answer and code it and say, yes, this is talking about training, this is talking about free food, this is talking about my commute, whole range of different things. But that doesn't give you much insight, right? So on the negative questions about what's not good at working for the firm, managers are almost always in the top 3, right? But it doesn't really tell you what it is about them. And you can go into a bit more detail and start having more granular, but just counting the instances gives you a sense of perspective, but doesn't really build this story. So we then like using an analysis which says, okay, well, managers are often linked with communication. People talk about those things in the same sentence, or they're linked about micromanagement, and micromanagement links to working from home. And we build the sort of network, this graph about how people are doing it. And then we can cluster that using statistical techniques and say, okay, actually you've got 6 different populations who are answering this question in broadly similar things within that population, but very different. So within a traditional survey, they might talk about things to do with business and performance and the values of the organizations. And we know that we know that's one type of group. And then another will talk about their benefits. Another will talk about operational difficulties or their career development. So we create clusters and segments, and then we can take in the demographic data. And that demographic data might be their age, their gender, whereabouts in the organization work for, but it might also be behavioral data. It might be how they've answered the quantitative questions. And we can sort of say, okay, well, the people talking about the values and the strategy of the firm, we know they're 2 times more likely to be a high performer than you would expect given the size of this population. We know that they're 50% more likely to be a woman. They're university educated. They've been here with under 3 years. And from there, just by getting this type of analysis, we've got a good starter of a persona. We've identified their needs. We've mapped on a probabilistic basis who's more likely to be in this group as possible. And then combining that with probably some quotes from that group gives a really human picture. I would love to have a full-size cutout of Jane in that group who's there. But if you look at a typical persona sheet that many experienced folks use, we're managing through algorithms to find that sort of stuff really quite quickly, and we've got data on that. So, and this is a bit of a difference between the sort of, IDEO. Have you got the IDEO cards, the 52 greeting?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, I've got a very old copy of it here somewhere. But a lot of their things in terms of going out and watching people in their domestic environments or whatever to do that type of, that's super expensive, super time consuming research that you can only do with a relatively small number of people. unless you have Unilever's budgets on, that type of thing. Even still, you can still only do it on the small ones. And certainly if we're doing things like a usability study, you will know that the general advice is you probably don't need to do many more than 10 and you find the results, right? Yeah. So that deep qual stuff. Now, the work that we do is not such deep qual. It's not like coding interviews, which we have done. It's very broad, but there's a few advantages over it. One, we can see a global population quickly. So if the experience in headquarters in London is different from the experience of a sales team in Buenos Aires, we can see and show that these two groups are different. So we can look at this sort of and recruiting for those sort of studies. When we did usability at UBS, we often used to do it in the London branch because we could recruit somebody who's recently jumped off a plane from Asia, and we could get an Asian's perspective of this rather than a British perspective. But unless you start having those numbers, you can't balance it out quite so well. And secondly, there still is a worry for me about statistical validity. And it's all to do with, have the 12 people or 10 people you recruited being valued. The last point is, what we do is remarkably cheaper than the qual stuff, right? So at UBS, I was at UBS before the financial crisis. Budgets were still pretty healthy, and we were able to spend well into six figures a year on research. Well into six figures, doing everything by the book, how you would do it if you were the front office business. And we've had instances where we've had clients doing that on things like employee value proposition, and they've called in a big research consultancy and they've spent six-figure euros doing this research, and they've got within a few percent difference of what we did in a day and a half on looking at a big data set, right? So you could do approximation. If I was doing usability now, I would probably use Zoom, get the design team in one room, get somebody using the site and there guided through and do the usability study, but just do it in the house, right? Do it today, and you wouldn't get such a wonderful view as you would get hiring somebody whose job it is all the time, but you probably get 80% there. You probably get 90% there. And sometimes it's about that. It's about being pragmatic, especially in HR when the budgets are never.
Well, I was going to say, and I think that's something, which going back to what you said earlier on around some of the changes, is I think because technology is now and continue to allowing us to, the price is coming down, definitely. We're able to listen much more kind of on a granular level. Listening posts you can have them across the whole entire journey now, less siloed, or moving away from just annual engagement surveys. So I think that the ability to capture has increased, which is great through technology. I think for me, I still think we've got a little bit of way to go. And I think this is why, for me, the text analysis piece, which is obviously a big passion and focus for you and your organization, I think that's the bit. I still think there's this just, a little bit of kind of stick man, stick woman kind of, explanation to go, this is how it works. And this is kind of what actually you can get. These are the benefits you can get through this in a very, very rapid period.
Yep.
And allow you or enable you to do X, Y, Z. Because I think sometimes when we get into some of the, I this is going back a few years, but I built a candidate experience measurement tool. I've never done it in my life, built a dashboard. We're starting to look for kind of qual research, qual technology, and back then there wasn't that much on the market. But you can get deep into it very, very quickly and lose yourself as a non-expert or non-research mindset, which a lot of HR functions and are not. Just that's the way they are. So, what would you thinking about this kind of from a simple approach? Is there any kind of step-by-step approaches you would, if somebody's not doing any listening right now, is there any kind of really just basic guides or some low-hanging fruit? Let's get back to that, of people that could start to just to at least, because you know what it's like, Andrew, you've got to influence internally to get the budget, but you've got to start somewhere in order to influence to get the budget sometimes, or more often than not. and do a business case. So is there anything you would approach, or how you approach or recommend?
We've just got a client who I was speaking to earlier this week, who had just done a free trial on one of the survey tools, right? So, and there are things that getting an expensive thing can do that SurveyMonkey can't, but they're icing on the cake, right? Or you certainly can pilot and test, and a lot of I believe what we should be doing, as certainly in experience, but in HR a lot more, is pilots and experiments, and get something and just run it just get the permission to send everybody something there. In terms of the design of the surveys, keep it really short and simple. I suspect that you can get a template off a whole variety of sites of what would a great candidate experience survey look like, but you probably can keep it to 10 questions. I would ask for some form of eNPS. For that type of thing, I would probably look at a satisfaction type question or ease and friction type question. But I would also make sure you keep 2 open text questions. And we always recommend, if you have to do these in pairs. So you say, what's the best thing about the recruitment process? And what can we do to improve this? And the reason you ask twofold is very, very similar to the way that when we're being coached to give performance feedback to our teams, we always, start with the positives, tell them what they did well, and then let's look at the challenges. You just get so much richer data if you ask everybody those questions. In the consumer marketplace, it was often they would ask an eNPS question and then a why, and they would assume that the people who were positive didn't have any improvements, and they would assume that the people who are negative didn't think anything went well, and that's obviously not true. The other thing, and this is most of the technologists won't tell you this when they're trying to sell you a tool, is that sentiment analysis is remarkably inaccurate. Right.
Yeah.
So, there's been academic studies that show that even the best in-class tools are getting about 65% accuracy. In fact, if you look at the research, it's a hard problem for humans to agree on. So it's one of those things we all think we can do. But if you get 5 people to review something in the room, they won't get a full agreement. So, so you obviously have 4 people who are wrong in that room. So it's a hard thing. And by getting the question to ask what great things and what are the negative things, to a much greater degree, you enable you to understand whether somebody mentions it's a positive or negative. The reality of sentiment and text in feedback is that people don't write full sentences, right? And if you get 1,000 comments for an employee survey, a human might not be able to understand 100 of them. What was the person really trying to tell us here? They're writing a few words. Obviously, when they start getting those medians of 25, but I remember one instance where we weren't getting good performance on one of our models, so we just reviewed the 5,000 shortest responses, and we could only work out about 700 what they actually meant. We just had no idea. Yeah. It was just so ambiguous. So you can't expect a computer to do it if a human can't do it. So that counters that problem that the technology. I just don't think the technology is going to be there anytime soon. Try something. Try it quick. I mean, there's a lot of information. I'm sure you find a template, but make sure certainly at the early stage where you don't really know what the issues are, you ask open choice questions. And this is to counter the issue that I think you and I have both had, and certainly in hotels, you stay somewhere and they send you a thing and say, what was it? What was the food like? What was the internet connectivity like? What was this? And they give these 30 or 4 links. And the thing that really frustrated you is you got into bed, you had to switch the lights off on the other side of the room. There was no way of doing it. They were all linked together, right? And I just want to switch the lights off before I go to bed, right? This is, and it becomes trying to understand. You have a PhD in hotel lighting systems because there's some. You laugh, you've been there, right? And they don't ask that one thing that you really care about. And by just asking an open question and not going through each of the points, they can tell you everything. right? And they'll tell you things that you never thought about. They'll tell you that one of the things that frustrates the executive team is that the car park's full of potholes, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that goes back to if like the hotels, because you're asking about a specific part of the customer journey that they want to be scored on. So how's the Wi-Fi? They want to score for the Wi-Fi. It's I think it's great advice. I think it's probably the foundation is just to put all of that to one side. And actually, you're right. I think I'll share a couple of tools. There's like getfeedback.com. There's Typeform. They're probably two of my favorites.
Yeah, Typeform's lovely.
The UX and the UI is amazing. I mean, once you start to see some of those responses come through, it's really just a basic, eNPS or CNPS in candidate. You're able to also then just slice and dice that by if somebody's giving it a 1 or a 10, whether they're a promoter or a detractor, you're able to then group those detractors, pull it just to one side, and then look at then the verbatim and then the comments.
Yeah,
it just gives you. It doesn't have to be perfect, but again, as you say, it's just experimenting with it and getting a feel for what's starting to come out.
And certainly in early days when you're piloting and experimenting, something like candidate experience. I mean, as I said, at UBS, when we were doing new joiner experience, we had 16,000 hires. We were right up there in the top 1% of organizations who have that type of hiring issue, right? So, whereas, we do candidate experience for a bunch of clients. They are almost exclusively in tech sector, and they are on massive growth, and therefore hiring is kind of what HR is about. It's the number one priority for them as business. Most organizations will have a few hundred maximum of people joining every year or going through these type of processes. Just read them, right? Don't put some good technology. Just read them. Stick the ideas on Post-its and arrange them on a wall. Do really low tech stuff. Bring those into, bring those cut out each quote, put it on a Post-it, and in your workshop, just do a card sorting exercise, right? And just get people to do it in a really low tech way and to engage with the data in that sort of stuff. So don't overcomplicate it is my number one advice.
Especially getting started, and it's easily done. It's definitely easily done.
Yeah, and when you've done those experiments and proved what's working and what's not working, you can then go to an expert and put it in at that extra 20% effectiveness. You can put in processes, you can put in technology, but the way that we build our stuff is we always just prototype and pilot, and we'll read an academic paper on something new technique and text, and we'll try it out, and then we bin most of those ideas after a week or so because they just don't work, or they're not giving us performance benefit, or they're costing a squillion dollars on Google compute servers to do the processing because it's just so heavy. So, some of it, but you pilot it as quickly as possible and you abandon it as quickly as possible.
Definitely.
And there's enough stuff on the internet that you can find out how to do a straw man, for 10, and,
easy.
Yeah, it's easy.
Yeah. Lots to get started. Well, look, Andrew, that's, this time is absolutely whipped by. So thank you so much for just sharing a little bit more into your world and the world of text analytics and the importance of this stuff. It's I think the more we at least start to listen and to understand what these words mean and in what context and what benefit, and then turn them into benefits both for the organization and more importantly employees as well. It's vitally important right now. And I think the cornerstone of any good employee experience strategy is listening strategy. Yeah. So it is the cornerstone, and probably in my mind, probably one of the foundations, probably very close to a target operating model. So really, really, that's why I'm super interested in your work, and thanks so much for sharing. And
pleasure.
How can people get in contact with you? Have you got any? Do you have any kind of? I know you're a keen blog writer, or I know you've done some various posts over the years. Have you got anything perhaps we can share a link to on the page, or anything of interest that you think could?
I'll pick out a few. There's if you look on our website, there's over 100 quite long form articles over the last that we've done, and vast majority of them are there. There's the most popular ones have been in segmentation, which has been a topic we explored again earlier in the year. There's articles on technical issues, and there's a contact form, and that's probably the easiest way to get in. Otherwise, reach out on LinkedIn and I'll try and get back. But and I'm happy to just get on a call and talk to HR teams who are doing this stuff for the first time and just give them a few tips and hints. We believe that our mission is to make analyzing text as easy as analyzing numbers in from you're getting from the spreadsheet, and if we can do that, then we're helping somebody and really therefore helping the employers to get better experiences, which is a good way of looking at it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely in the employee experience moment right now. I have been for a few years, but this seems to be right in the thick of it. And COVID, of course, has accelerated a lot of those conversations. In so many different ways. So it's in a funny way, I think there's some good to be had out of this awful situation as well. So
our data's showing it's accelerated a trend that was already happening, and it's accelerated by about 3 or 4 years.
Wow, amazing. Good. Well, that's a good positive to end up on. So, Andrew.
Great speaking to you as always.
Oh, great, Andrew. Thanks for your time, mate. Really
Pleasure.
Appreciate it. All right,
okay.
Take care. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
And there you have it, another episode of the Experienced Designers podcast. Thank you so much to my guest, Andrew. Absolute pleasure to have you on the show. And of course, if you wish to connect, all of the links and also a couple of the helpful blog posts or helpful documents that we talked about at the end of the show, I'll of course put links in there for you as well. Thanks ever so much for listening. And until the next time, bye for now.